Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the short story, The Haunted Mirror, narrated by Jim. On a deserted road far from the bustling town, Emily's house stood alone like someone forgotten by the world. Here, far from the bright lights and noisy sounds of the city, only the deadly silence of the surrounding ancient forests remained. The house was not what one would think of when looking for a place to call home, but for Emily, it was the beginning of a new journey, a step away from the chaotic life she had endured for far too long. This house had belonged to her family for many generations, once the residence of her ancestors, but had been abandoned after events that Emily knew little about. Even when she inherited it from her grandmother, she never imagined that one day she would decide to move here. However, after months of exhaustion from work and city life, she felt it was time for a change, and nothing could achieve that better than leaving the city, living in her ancestral home, and starting over. The day she arrived, the weather in this small town in Maine was far from welcoming. The cold wind blew in gusts, sweeping through the bare branches, making the atmosphere grim and desolate. Emily shivered in her thick coat, her eyes fixed on the old house appearing through the mist. Dust-covered wooden planks, gray-streaked walls, and windows seemingly corroded by time all created a dismal picture. Yet something about it drew her in. This house wasn't just an old home. It was part of her family, part of the bloodline that ran through her veins. She felt an inexplicable connection, as if the place was calling to her, as though the house had stories still left untold.
Here it is.
Emily whispered to herself as her car stopped in front of the porch. Stepping out of the car, she took a deep breath. The musty scent of cold earth filled her nose, but it didn't bother her. Instead, she felt an odd sense of peace, as if she had finally come home. In the first few days, everything went relatively smoothly. Emily spent most of her time cleaning the old house. Every room was covered in dust, cobwebs clung to corners, and the antique furniture sat still like silent witnesses of time. She didn't feel fear. On the contrary, she felt like she was uncovering fragments of her family's history. Every item, every painting, every old book carried a story, and she was captivated by them. The house wasn't very big, but it had an attic that Emily had yet to explore. The stairs leading up to it creaked with every step, as if the house was welcoming her. When she opened the attic door, Emily froze. The room before her was pitch black, dust covered every inch, and the air inside was colder than she had anticipated. But what caught her attention the most was a large mirror in the center of the room, covered by an old, tattered cloth worn by time. She didn't know why the mirror was there, nor how long it had been sitting there. But something compelled Emily to walk over, cautiously pulling the cloth away. The mirror was old, its wooden frame intricately carved but showing signs of decay. The glass itself was still intact but covered in dust, making the reflection hazy. Emily bent down, breathed lightly on the glass, and wiped away the dust with her hand. As the dust cleared, her reflection gradually appeared. But something wasn't right. She saw her reflection, but there was a slight change. So small, yet enough to send a shiver down her spine. She tried to dismiss it.
It's probably just my imagination,
she told herself, though deep inside, the unease lingered. Day by day, Emily tried to forget about the mirror in the attic. But she couldn't. Every time she went upstairs, she felt the strange presence of the mirror urging her. She didn't know why, but each time she thought of it, her heart raced faster, and her breath grew heavier. Then one night, the worst happened. Emily was sleeping in the dead of night when everything was silent, and suddenly she felt as if someone was standing in the room. She opened her eyes, the room still shrouded in darkness, but immediately she saw something that almost made her faint with terror. The mirror from the attic had been moved into her bedroom, though she had not done it. In the mirror, something was off. Her reflection didn't behave normally. It stood there in the mirror, staring back at her, but the eyes weren't hers. and then the reflection smiled. Emily sprang up, screaming in horror. But when she looked again, the mirror was gone. From that moment on, she knew her life would never be the same. Every night, she was haunted by nightmares about the mirror. In her dreams, she stood before the mirror, but the reflection was not her. It was someone else, a malicious spirit, waiting to break free. Emily didn't know how much longer she could endure. The house she once thought was a safe haven had now become a prison. Every time she saw the mirror, it felt like it was slowly consuming her soul. After that horrifying night, everything in Emily's life began to change in ways she couldn't understand. She had once thought that the incident with the mirror was just a nightmare, but day by day, mysterious and terrifying events started occurring more frequently. The house, once the place she intended to start a new life, had now become a haunted home, enveloped by an inescapable presence that she couldn't shake off. Day 1 after the horrifying night. That morning, Emily woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest. She couldn't forget the image of the mirror from the night before, though it was no longer in her room. Telling herself that it was just a hallucination, Emily tried to start her day as usual. However, as she stepped into the living room, an eerie sensation crept over her. The air in the house felt heavier, colder. The walls seemed to close in around her, and even the smallest sound made her heart race. When she looked out the window, Emily noticed a frightening stillness surrounding the house, as if the entire outside world had been cut off by the house. She tried to reassure herself and continued with the task of cleaning the house, but everything made her uneasy. The chairs, the tables, and the household items all seemed to be watching her, and every time she turned her back, it felt as if someone was observing her. Emily decided to go up to the attic, where the mirror had once been hidden. She couldn't forget about it. Deep down, she knew she shouldn't go back, but something pushed her to confront it. As she opened the attic door, a cold gust of air blew through, sending a shiver down her spine. The mirror was still there, intact, silently standing in the middle of the room, but its presence was entirely different. It no longer felt like an inanimate object, but as though it had life, waiting for her. Emily hesitated as she stepped closer. She leaned down and looked into the mirror. Her reflection stared back, but the eyes in the mirror didn't seem to belong to her anymore. They were empty, soulless, as if they were trying to convey something she couldn't understand. Suddenly, a whisper echoed behind her, causing her to spin around in shock. No one was in the room. Her heart pounded, her hands shook as she turned back to the mirror. The reflection had changed. It wasn't her anymore, but an unfamiliar woman with a pale face and cold, emotionless eyes staring right back at her. From that moment on, Emily began to realize that the house wasn't simply a shelter, it was a place harboring horrifying secrets. She spent the entire day trying to uncover the house's history, but everything was unclear and foggy. In the documents left by her grandmother, there was no mention of the origin of the mirror or any strange events in the past. She decided to ask the townspeople, hoping to find a clue. When she entered the small cafe in the center of town, a place she had never visited, all eyes turned toward her. The people here were not unfamiliar with the house she was living in. It was a place they had always avoided mentioning, like a taboo. When she brought up the house, the looks became uncomfortable and wary. An old man with a long white beard sat in the corner of the cafe and called her over.
You shouldn't be in that house. There are things in that house you should never seek to understand.
Emily, confused but determined, asked,
What do you know about the house?
The man shook his head and took a long drag of his cigarette.
Everyone who ever lived in that house. None of them left intact. And the mirror you found, it's the worst part of it.
Emily was stunned.
The mirror. You know about it.
The man nodded.
It's not just an ordinary mirror. It's a window to another world, a place ruled by darkness. Anyone who looks into it will never be the same.
The old man's words left Emily rattled. She felt them as a warning, but at the same time, they felt like a crucial piece she needed to understand the mirror's true nature. Day 3. That night, Emily returned home with growing dread in her heart. She tried to stay away from the mirror, but her mind was constantly haunted by it. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of the strange woman in the mirror, the woman who kept smiling, a mocking smile. She woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise from the attic. Part of her wanted to stay in bed, pretending not to hear anything, but another part urged her to check. She grabbed her flashlight, walking step by step up the stairs, the creaky steps under her feet like a warning. When she reached the attic, the door opened on its own, and there she saw the mirror, no longer covered in dust. The mirror was gleaming as if freshly polished, and the reflection didn't show the dark attic anymore but a different room, an elegant yet old-fashioned living room, filled with skeletons chained to the walls. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She stepped back, intending to turn and run, but then a voice from within the mirror called out, clearer than ever before.
"You'll never escape, Emily."
She screamed in horror, but no one could hear her. In the dim light of the fourth morning, Emily woke up feeling as if her body had been drained of all energy. The nightmares from the previous night haunted her, making every sleep a battle filled with fear and helplessness. Even when she opened her eyes, she could still feel the strange gaze of the woman in the mirror, the mocking smile that continued to follow her, even though she was awake. The faint sunlight was not enough to dispel the gloom that surrounded the house. Emily sat up, gently rubbing her forehead and taking a deep breath. The room still had an eerie feeling. Everything around her seemed to be filled with an invisible presence. Despite trying to forget what had happened during the night, she couldn't deny that something was slowly eating away at her sanity. As she walked down the stairs, she tried to keep herself busy by cleaning the house. However, the more she scrubbed and cleaned, the more she felt the shift in the space. The old walls seemed to melt as if they were dissolving, and the objects in the house made strange clicking noises, as if they were creeping closer to her. The ringing of the phone startled her. Emily reached out to answer, hoping for some connection to the outside world. The voice of the bank manager echoed from the other end, informing her that she had received a strange letter from someone claiming to be the guardian of the house. The letter contained only a short, cryptic message. "Don't look in the mirror. Don't let it see through you." Emily set the phone down, a chill running down her spine. She wondered whether this was a serious warning or just someone playing a prank. But everything that had been happening to her made it impossible to dismiss the letter. Day 5. Slowly losing control. The next day, Emily decided to invite a paranormal expert from a nearby university. She didn't know how to face what was happening, and the man she had met at the cafe the day before had advised her to seek professional help. The expert, named Jack, arrived with a calm but cautious demeanor. He carried strange equipment, like electromagnetic field detectors and recorders.
"This house, it has a very strange kind of energy,"
Jack said as he stepped inside. He carefully walked down the hallways, his sharp eyes observing every hidden corner.
"I can feel something very powerful here."
Emily followed behind him, her eyes filled with worry.
Do you think this is all just my imagination?
She asked, hoping that everything was just a misunderstanding. Jack shook his head.
"No, Emily. I think there's something real here, and it's not your imagination."
They headed up to the attic, where the mirror still stood in the dark corner. Emily kept a safe distance while Jack approached the mirror. He turned on the electromagnetic detector, and the needle immediately jumped.
"Just as I thought, this mirror is not an ordinary object. It's like a portal to something else."
Emily swallowed hard, her hands clenching together.
I saw a woman in the mirror, but it wasn't me. She smiled at me.
Jack was silent for a moment, then turned to her, his expression serious.
"Emily, I don't think this is just a spirit. Could be an evil force, and it's trying to control you."
Just as Jack finished speaking, the air in the room suddenly became oppressive. The mirror trembled slightly, as if someone from the other side was trying to push through. Emily stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. Jack quickly stepped back, trying to stay calm.
I think we should leave right now.
Jack said, his voice no longer as calm as before.
This mirror is more dangerous than I thought.
They hurried down the stairs, but just as they reached the bottom, a hissing sound echoed from above. Emily turned around, and for a moment, she saw a dark shadow pass through the mirror before it vanished. Day 6, the invasion of darkness. Emily couldn't leave the house. Part of her wanted to run, but another part was strangely drawn to the house and the mysterious mirror. In the nights that followed, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard whispers from the attic, calling from the mirror that she couldn't ignore. One night, Emily lay in the dark, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The room was so silent she could hear every beat of her heart. But then, from the corner of the room, footsteps echoed. She knew she wasn't alone. Emily sat up abruptly, her eyes fixed on the darkness.
Who is there?
She whispered, her voice catching in her throat. No response, but the footsteps continued, coming closer, as if someone was moving through the house. Emily got out of bed, her hands trembling as she grabbed the flashlight. She walked towards the stairs, and from downstairs, a soft giggling sound echoed, a woman's laugh, but it wasn't hers. Emily clutched the flashlight tightly, stepping down each stair cautiously. As she neared the living room door, she heard soft breathing as if someone was waiting for her. The door slowly creaked open, and in the darkness, the mirror appeared. But this time, it wasn't still. In the mirror, her reflection no longer appeared as it had before. Instead, a woman with cold eyes and a sinister smile stood staring back at her. Emily couldn't move. The smile in the mirror widened, and suddenly the woman in the mirror stepped out, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The room plunged into darkness, and Emily screamed, but her sound was swallowed by the space around her. The next morning, the sound of rain falling outside, the gray sky with no sunlight, only made the atmosphere even gloomier. Emily sat in an armchair in the living room, her eyes fixed on the cold cup of coffee in her hands. She hadn't been able to sleep all night, the image of the strange mirror and the mysterious woman in it continuously appearing in her mind, preventing her from looking away. She didn't know what to do. It felt like her life was being slowly drained by the mirror, bit by bit. Each day, she felt more trapped in the house, controlled by the mirror, like a puppet with no escape. In the beginning, she could still leave the house for a while to breathe in the fresh air outside, but now, every time she tried to step outside, it felt as though an invisible force was pulling her back, stopping all her efforts to escape. The phone rang, shattering the silence in the house, startling Emily. She reached for the receiver, and on the other end was the familiar voice of Jack, the paranormal expert who had come to help her a few days ago.
Emily, are you okay?
Jack asked, his voice filled with concern. Emily closed her eyes, trying to calm herself.
I don't know anymore. Everything's getting worse. I feel like I'm losing control.
Jack sighed on the other end.
I've been thinking about what we found. The mirror is not just haunted. It's a gateway, a door between two worlds. And whatever is on the other side is trying to come through.
But how can I stop it? Cannot go on like this. I feel like I'm going insane.
Emily asked, her voice filled with despair. Jack was silent for a moment, then spoke quietly.
I'm not sure if it can be stopped, but there is someone who might know better. She's an expert in ancient paranormal phenomena, living on the outskirts of the city. I'll send you her address.
That afternoon, Emily decided to meet the woman Jack mentioned. The address Jack provided led her to a small house on the outskirts of town. The house looked old, surrounded by thick woods, far from the residential area. The closer she got to the house, the more suffocating the atmosphere became, as if some power was waiting for her here. She passed through the rotting wooden gate and approached the front door, knocking lightly. An elderly woman with a wrinkled face and deep-set eyes appeared behind the door. She wore a long cloak, looking like an ancient witch from folklore.
I knew you would come. I could sense the presence of that mirror.
The old woman said, her voice small but filled with authority. Emily wasn't surprised by her words. She had become too familiar with the strange events she was facing. She just wanted answers.
A mirror. It's controlling me. What do I need to do to escape it?
Emily whispered. The old woman cast a sharp gaze at Emily, then pointed to a nearby chair, signaling for her to sit down.
The mirror you possess is not an ordinary mirror. It once belonged to a very powerful person who used it to control the souls of innocent people. Through generations, the mirror has been passed on, and whenever it finds a new owner, it binds them into an endless cycle of entrapment.
Emily felt her heart race.
So, is there a way to break free?
The old woman sat across from her, her eyes gleaming in the dim light.
There is a way, but it's a very dangerous ritual. If you don't perform it correctly, you will be forever trapped inside the mirror, along with the souls imprisoned within.
Emily stared at the old woman, her mind battling between hope and fear. She had few options left. The mirror had slowly taken over her life, and if she didn't act, she would never escape.
So what do I need to do?
She asked, her voice resolute. The old woman nodded.
You must perform a ritual to sever the connection between you and the mirror. But this ritual requires you to face the darkness within yourself and confront the soul haunting the mirror.
That night, Emily returned home with the instructions from the old woman. She prepared for the ritual, clearing a space in the living room and placing candles around the mirror, just as the old woman had instructed. The house grew even gloomier and more oppressive. The mirror lay still in the center of the room, but Emily felt as if it was watching her every move. She sat down, breathing deeply to steady herself. What she was about to do would be the greatest challenge she had ever faced. If she failed, she might be lost forever in the world inside the mirror, never to return. Emily closed her eyes and began reciting the incantations the old woman had taught her. Her whispers echoed in the space, as if the house itself was reacting to every word. Cold wind began to blow through the cracks in the doors, causing the candles to flicker. As soon as she finished the last incantation, a blinding light emanated from the mirror. Emily opened her eyes to see that her reflection had completely changed. It was no longer her, but the woman with the soulless eyes, smiling mockingly.
You cannot escape. I won't let you leave.
The woman's voice came from the mirror, cold and full of power. The room shook, and the mirror began to tremble violently. Emily felt the mirror's force trying to pull her inside. Everything around her blurred, as if the real world was fading away, and the world within the mirror was slowly taking its place. Emily fought back, struggling to keep herself from being sucked in, but the darkness from the mirror was like invisible hands pulling her closer. The woman's eyes in the mirror gleamed, and Emily felt a chilling cold rush down her spine. Emily screamed, using all her remaining strength to resist the power overtaking her. She had to break the connection. She couldn't let her soul be trapped in the mirror.
I've been waiting for you. Tonight, everything will end.
A cold voice echoed from behind the mirror. It was the voice of the mysterious woman whom Emily had seen many times in the haunted mirror. Emily took a step back, trying to escape the haunting gaze from the mirror. But in that moment, she realized that running away was no longer an option. Darkness was surrounding her, pulling her into a reality she couldn't escape. Emily took a deep breath, gathering all her courage to face the mirror. She knew that if she gave in, if she let fear consume her, she would never escape this place. The words of the old woman echoed in her mind.
The mirror reveals the deepest fears of the soul. You must confront them, or be trapped forever.
Emily stepped closer to the mirror, her hand trembling as she touched the cold surface. As soon as her fingers made contact with the glass, a powerful shockwave emanated from the mirror. The room darkened, everything around her disappeared, as if the entire world had shrunk down to just her and the mirror. Her most haunting memories began to appear before Emily's eyes. The image of her mother, pale-faced and sorrowful, appeared in the mirror. Her mother had passed away when Emily was young, and since then, she had always lived in fear of loneliness. Now, the mirror was bringing that pain to the surface, as if it knew that this was her greatest weakness.
Emily, why did you leave me?
Her mother's voice came from within the mirror, gentle yet filled with sorrow. Emily felt her chest tighten. She knew that wasn't her mother, but the image in the mirror was so real, so vivid. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought to suppress her emotions.
You're not real. You've been gone for a long time.
Emily whispered. The woman in the mirror, who claimed to be her mother, gave a faint smile.
Are you sure? I've always been here waiting for you. All you need to do is step through the mirror, and we can be together again.
Emily closed her eyes tightly, feeling the temptation of the woman's voice. But she knew it was a trap, a way for the mirror to control her.
You're gone, and I won't let this mirror imprison me.
As soon as Emily spoke those last words, the image of the woman in the mirror vanished, replaced by other visions. The old house where she lived alone, where every corner, every sound haunted her. Emily saw herself standing in her bedroom, but everything was distorted and twisted. There was no escape, no place to hide. Everything around her began to warp, suffocating her with an unnamed fear. The darkness from the mirror now spread throughout the room, surrounding Emily like an invisible net. She could hear whispers from all directions, strange voices tempting her to give up, to succumb to her fear.
You can't escape, you belong here.
A ghostly voice echoed from the darkness. Emily fell to her knees, feeling as though her body was being pulled into an endless void. But in that moment, she realized that only she could save herself. No one else could help her win this battle. She had to face her greatest fears: loneliness, loss, and despair. She stood up, staring into the mirror.
You will not control me anymore.
She said loudly, each word affirming her resolve.
This mirror will not dictate my life.
The surface of the mirror began to tremble, and from it, the figure of the sinister woman appeared once more, her eyes glowing red with fury. She raised her hand, and instantly, the room around Emily transformed into a surreal, nightmarish space. Shadows emerged from every side, closing in on her, trying to pull her into the endless darkness. But this time, Emily was no longer afraid. She stepped forward, facing the darkness engulfing her.
I'm not afraid of you. I will break this curse.
The mirror suddenly cracked, shattering into countless pieces, and with a piercing scream, the figure of the woman vanished completely. The room returned to normal, no more whispers, no more illusions. Emily collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. She had won, but her body and mind were drained. The darkness had retreated, but its traces still lingered in her every breath. She had faced herself, her deepest fears, and she had overcome them. Emily sat in silence on the floor, staring at the shards of the broken mirror. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. The house was eerily quiet now, as if it too had been freed from the darkness the mirror had brought. Jack called her the next morning.
Emily, are you okay?
His voice was filled with concern. Emily smiled weakly.
I did it. Broke free.
Jack sighed in relief.
I knew you would. You're stronger than any force out there.
But deep down, Emily knew that this battle wasn't just about the mirror. It was a battle with the fear inside her, and she had won not just with bravery, but with belief in herself. The nightmares might have ended, but the memories of them would stay with her, a reminder of the difficult journey she had endured. And now, after everything, Emily knew that she had found herself again. the story ends here. If you found it interesting, feel free to hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share it. And now, it's time to say goodbye.